Employers should not be forcing employees to come to work if they're not ready to do so. We've been clear with employers.
Welcome to this week's Focus BC with me, Sonia Deol, now with British Columbia navigating its way through phase 2 of the province's restart plan for the economy. Businesses are starting to slowly reopen, but a lot of employees are saying that they're worried about going back into work. So where do you stand legally? If you tell your boss you don't want to come in, could making that decision effectively cost you your job? And what if you're an employer? What do you do if you're faced with these questions? We have with us employment lawyer Leah Moody. She says her firm is receiving lots of calls about these issues right now. Leah, thanks so much for your time today. What are people telling you? What are you hearing?
Well, I mean, right now, the primary concern, as you've just identified, is certainly a concern about returning to a workplace that people aren't sure is going to be safe and what their rights are in the event that they return and they don't feel that it's safe. And of course, conversely, employers want to know what they can and should be doing about any employee who's not coming to the workplace on account of safety concerns. So that's probably the main one.
Well, legally, where do people stand? For a start, if you're an employee, can you be forced to go back in?
Well, sure. I mean, and let's start with just the basics, because obviously there's been a really seismic change in the world as we know it lately, but employment law isn't frozen. And employers have and have always had the obligation to keep a workplace safe and hazard-free. You, as an employee, have the right to a safe workplace, to come to a workplace that you feel is safe and doesn't raise a concern with respect to safety or hazards. You have a right to know what those hazards are, and you have a right to know what your employer is doing in response to any particular hazards. So my first line of attack with respect to an employee who's concerned about safety in the workplace is to ask the question. Call your employer up, contact your HR, and ask, what is your plan? How are you going to be making the workplace safe for me to return?
If you say no, if you've done all of that and you still don't feel comfortable and you say, no, I don't want to come in because of my safety, so it's more based on a feeling, can that effectively cost you your job? Could you get fired for that?
I mean, technically, yes. If you're just doing this based on a feeling, and I don't want to minimize that feeling is completely understandable from an employee's perspective, right? We've just spent the last 8 weeks being told that we shouldn't go anywhere, and now we're being asked to be brave enough to go back out into the workplace. And so those feelings are certainly legitimate, and you should communicate those feelings to your employer. But if you, as an employee, have made a complaint to your employer with respect to safety, that complaint has been investigated by your employer, and it's been deemed to be a safe workplace, your employer is following every government recommendation, then you, the employee, have to go to work. Unfortunately, your feeling about it being unsafe is not going to override an objective analysis of whether or not the workplace is actually safe.
Okay, but the first thing, as you said, is to have those conversations. Now, should those conversations happen in writing or over phone calls? What's your legal perspective there?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to always recommend that it goes in writing. But ultimately, I think that this comes down to your comfort level too, right? If you just want to pick up the phone because that's how you're used to speaking to your employer, pick up the phone and have that conversation. If you are going to be engaging in what's known as a formal refusal to work on account of an unsafe work environment or an unsafe work environment complaint, then you do want to put that complaint in writing just in case it eventually needs to be escalated to WorkSafe BC. And so that they can have a record of that complaint.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking it really depends on who your employer is. How large is that business? Does it have, a health and safety representative or department? What do you do depending on where you work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best person to speak with is obviously a representative from the Joint Health and Safety Committee if your employer has one. If not, I would just take your complaint to somebody in the Human Resources Department, as they're likely going to be tasked with creating the COVID-19 plan that's being required of businesses in BC that are reopening. And if there is no Human Resources Department, just speak directly to your boss.
Okay, let's switch to employers in that case for a minute. What if you don't have an HR department? Should you be worried?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that it's important that you're getting good advice, and that's generally what your HR department is there for, is to make sure that they're corresponding with a lawyer and figuring out how to conduct themselves going forward. But, the beauty of the internet and the age that we live in right now is that all of this information is available online. WorkSafe BC has been fabulous about posting their guidelines and their recommendations, all available on the glorious World Wide Web. So if you don't have an HR department, there's no concern. Just, get on trusty Google and look up what the government's recommending that you do.
I'm also trying to look at this from, that employer's point of view. You've had a few months during this pandemic, revenue not coming in. We know that businesses are struggling financially. If you're then faced with your workers saying they don't feel safe to come in despite all the measures you're putting into place, and you're saying that, they're within their rights to terminate the employment of that person and fire them. What are you saying? Should they, even though they legally can do that, is that what, should they be doing that at this stage when everybody's having such a tough time?
Yeah, and I think you've hit on such a good point, and it's something that I'm trying to keep in mind as well, that there's certainly a legal answer to all of this, that's straightforward, but there's a human component to this as well, and that's so important to keep in mind. This is truly unprecedented times, and we're all dealing with our own demons, so to speak. And I think that it can go a long way just to have an open and honest conversation with your employees. So if you're faced with an employee as a company, as an employer, who doesn't want to come to work because they're not feeling safe, even though you know that you're taking every measure, sure, you can discipline them, you can terminate them, you can make that difficult, and you do have the right to do so. But in my view, I think that, the first step should be to pick up the phone. Pick up the phone, have that call, see if there's any sort of accommodation that can be made, see if there's any compromise that can be worked out, because we are all in this together, and it's our joint and collective responsibility to make sure that we are doing our part to keep the world safe, keep our workplaces safe, but also to restart the economy.
Now, I hate to bring this up. I know people have very legitimate, genuine concerns, but we know at the same time there will be some people who will use this as an excuse not to go in, and that's bad news for a business owner that's already under huge financial pressure.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that there are people who, were kind of maybe looking to move on from their job anyway, and so might just use this as an opportunity to stay home. I know that a lot of people have concerns that employees are getting paid through CERB or some other social assistance program and might just enjoy watching Netflix and getting paid to do it. But that's why we do have these systems in place, and that is why you as an employer do have the right to discipline an employee who's not coming to work if they don't have a valid safety concern or a childcare obligation. And if the employee still isn't responding, you do have, as an employer, the right to terminate that employment or to potentially construe it as a job abandonment.
What do you anticipate is going to happen over the next few weeks?
I'd love to have a crystal ball, but I think that for the most part, we're coming up to the end of temporary layoff periods, right? I mean, BC extended their temporary layoff period from 13 weeks to 16 weeks. So I imagine that a lot of people are going to be recalled shortly this month, if not next. And I think that, over the past couple of months, businesses in BC have really been forced to pivot their business strategy, to figure out a different way of doing business. And they're going to be recalling employees to jobs that look a lot different. It could be as small as job duties or, doing curbside deliveries instead of working the cash, or it could be fairly significant. It could, be a reduction in hours or a reduction in pay wages. So I suspect that the majority of the calls over the next couple of months to my firm and to myself anyway are going to be in relation to these changes and whether or not they're required to accept them.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time today, Leah Moody, who's an employment lawyer. It is a tough time for sure.